Welcome to today's 5-minute Bible study. Today we begin a new study. We're back in the Old Testament. We're going to look at the book of Deuteronomy. Now, Deuteronomy is the 5th book of the Bible. Of course, the first 5 books are called the books of Moses: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These are often referred to as the Pentateuch, which comes from the word 5. You recognize the first 5 books. They're also more commonly referred to as the Torah, or the law, the instruction of God to his people. They're also called the books of Moses, for they come to us from Moses, who is the author of these books. And of course, in the first 5 books of the Bible, these books of Moses, we see the foundation for God's great plan of salvation for the world. Of course, Genesis is the story of creation, how God created the world, all that is in it. Tells us the story of the fall, how sin affected the creation, and how God immediately began his plan of salvation. How he called Abraham. Through Abraham, he would establish a family to be his own. Through that family, they would become the nation of God, Israel, through whom the Redeemer would come. We see this foundation laid all through the book of Genesis. And by the time we get to the end of Genesis, of course, the family is in Egypt. And then in Exodus, we see how the family becomes a nation. Now, in Egypt, they are enslaved and made to serve in terrible bondage. And God begins his process of redeeming his people. The family has now grown into a nation, but in bondage. So through Moses, God redeems the people by the Exodus. And then he brings them to Mount Sinai and establishes them as his people, giving them the covenant, the 10 commandments, and the law. And then as we move into Leviticus, God gives the instructions for how his nation, his people, are to worship him. And so Leviticus is all about the worship of the people of Israel. And then Numbers is a little more of the history of Israel, some of the wilderness wanderings, and how God continues to form the people and ready to them to enter the promised land. Those are the first 4 books. And then when we get to Deuteronomy, the last of the books of Moses, the people are on the verge of entering Canaan. They're now ready to enter the promised land. Moses is not going to go with them. Moses is not going to enter the promised land. Joshua will take them in. But Deuteronomy is Moses' final words to the people before they're ready to cross the Jordan River and take possession of the promised land. Now notice how Deuteronomy begins. Verse 1 of chapter 1. Now these are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel in the wilderness east of the Jordan. And then in verse 3 it says, it was in the 40th year, on the first day of the 11th month, that Moses proclaimed to the Israelites all that the Lord had commanded him concerning them. So we're told this is Moses' final word to the people. It occurs in the 40th year. What does that mean? Well, it's been 40 years since the Exodus. You remember, the first generation of Israelites did not believe God could give them possession of the land. So he said, you're going to spend 40 years in the wilderness. You're going to die. It is your children who will possess the land because you did not believe. So for 40 years, they lived in the wilderness. That original generation has died off. The children are now grown, and they are about to enter the promised land. So the 40th year, the days of wilderness wandering are over. This next generation of Israelites is about to enter the promised land. And before they do that, Moses has a final word to give to them. He's really going to reestablish the covenant with them, this new generation. He's going to remind them of all that God has done for them and all that God is going to do for them. So this word becomes very, very important. It's Moses' final word to the Israelites to prepare them to take possession of God's promised land. Now, the word Deuteronomy actually means second law. It means second law because in this book, Moses will state the law for a second time. We've got a few chapters in, he's going to restate the 10 commandments. It's not that the Israelites had forgotten them. They've been taught them all their life. But Moses wants to remind them, remember how God established his covenant with us at Sinai. He's now reestablishing it, renewing the covenant with you as you prepare yourself to enter the promised land. So it's going to be that second giving of the law, renewal of the covenant. So this word of Deuteronomy is very, very important. Moses' final word to the people to give them what they need as they enter the promise of God and take possession of the land of Canaan. So I hope you join us in the days to come as we carefully work our way through Deuteronomy and listen to Moses' parting words to the people of Israel, God's final instructions to them as they're ready to take possession of the promised land. So join us tomorrow as we continue looking and getting into our study, our 5-minute study of the book of Deuteronomy.